Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and I'm back with another installment in my Editorial Dude series. So tonight I have a sort of typically opinionated video for you on the topic of things that readers hate in fiction. So a couple disclaimers before I get started. The first is that this list that I will run through on this video is based on my reading of many reviews, many blogs, many listserv postings, and so forth over the years. You sort of get a sense, a critical mass develops in your own mind after you've seen enough comments about a particular facet or a typical or a particular technique. And when you see enough negative comments about that, you start to think, this is something that readers really don't like. So some of these are not necessarily things that I personally don't like, but things that I think that readers in general don't like. I think this is also a good opportunity to point out that editors, agents, industry professionals really do read what readers, everyday readers who are not writers, have to say about books and what they like and what they don't like, from the words and the plots right down to what's on the cover or the jacket. So by reviewing widely and publicly, you allow your voice and your tastes to be heard. And I think that that's a real benefit of the internet these days, in that the industry has a way to look at what so many different people have to say and try to figure out what people like and what they don't like based on their own words. So by reviewing, you make a contribution. And so I would like to ask everybody out there to review often and widely. Anything you read, fiction, nonfiction, long, short, old, or new. If you like it, please get the word out. So this list that I've got for you tonight is not the top seven. It's just seven narrative techniques or characteristics that I've pulled at random when I started thinking about what I might like to have in this video. There will likely be others, so please comment on here about what you don't like and why. And let's keep the conversation going. So, number one is present tense, a present tense narrative. So, the first time I remember reading a novel written in the present tense is in this book right here, North of Montana by April Smith. This book was published in 1994. I read it for a book club that I belonged to for about 10 years. And when I turned to the first page and I saw the present tense and the present progressive tense as the way the book was going to be told, I was very, very disconcerted. I had not read a present tense narrative before. I didn't know what to think about it. I kept expecting it to sort of peter out after a few chapters and not, and to revert to past tense. And that never happened. The entire book is written in present tense. And so are plenty of other books published now. So I would say back in the 90s, when I first encountered present tense narratives, I didn't care for them. And if there was a book I was interested in and I turned to the first page in the bookstore and I saw that it was present tense, I usually would put it down. It was not something that I really cared for. So I want to disclaim right here that this is purely a subjective opinion. A lot of people write in present tense and do it very well. It wasn't something that that appealed to me. So I've changed my attitude towards it somewhat as the years have passed. Now I don't discount present tense so much. Um, you know, that tense is what it is. You can't get a manuscript written in present tense and say to the author, okay, fine, but change everything to past tense. That really doesn't work. I don't think it can be done. Now I don't discount a present tense book, but I would say I read a book despite it being in present tense, not because of it being in present tense. I just don't find it that effective a narrative technique. And from reading reviews, I think a lot of readers agree with me. There's something jarring about it. There's, we don't, if you think of writing as conversational, which it isn't always, but often it is, we relate stories to one another of things that have happened to us in the past tense. So if you talk about what happened when you went to the mall to buy the latest hot toy for your grandkid, you relate that story in the past tense. You know how some other shopper elbowed you in the side to knock you over so that that person could get to the toy before you did. You tell it in past tense. That's the way we're used to hearing stories. So hearing it in present tense, it sounds artificial to me. It sounds a little jarring. And I think those who write in present tense or who like present tense would make the case that it gives a sense of immediacy, of being in the moment. And I get that. That makes sense to me objectively. Subjectively, it just will never be my favorite. And I think a lot of readers feel the same way. I don't know what necessarily editors and agents are thinking about present tense narratives these days. I haven't had a project in present tense come to me for quite some time. The last one was about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and the book was good. I mean, I liked it, and it got very good reviews. It got starred reviews actually in several of the big publications. So some reviewers out there like or don't mind present tense, but I think a lot of people don't. So I'd be curious what your opinions are about present tense, and if you think it works, why, and if you don't like it, why. So let us know by commenting here on the video. Point number 2 is a term that you may see called head hopping. And what head hopping refers to is point of view shifts within a chapter, within a paragraph, or even within a sentence. So the idea is that a story is told from one person's perspective at a time. It sort of helps the reader follow the plot or follow the perceptions from one perspective. So head hopping means moving from one character's thoughts to another, often in a pretty condensed space, so that the perspective is constantly shifting. And a lot of people find that very, very disorienting. When I was first learning about literature in high school, the term that they used was omniscient, right? That, the narrator knows all and tells all and reveals every character's thoughts and so forth. But it can make for a disconcerting reading experience. And I have noticed that when writers do this, you very often will see reviews saying, I found this book confusing because I felt like a ping pong ball being bounced around from one head to another. I don't see it much these days. I think that it might be sort of verboten among agents and editors. One book that I read that I really did love, it was so weird but so wonderful, is this one right here. Audrey Niffenegger's book, Glare is Bad, called Her Fearful Symmetry. And this book is about twin young women, I think very early 20s, who inherit a haunted London flat. And a ghost is sort of there who has an agenda in terms of what she wants to happen. And the point of view in this book shifts a lot, from paragraph to paragraph, page to page. I mean, it is a true exercise in that omniscient point of view. I really liked the book because I found it so unexpected and quirky and wonderfully odd. But the shifts in point of view take a lot of getting used to. So it took me about at least 50 pages to figure out that this was going to be the narrator's style, and that I had to kind of go along with it. It made the book, for me, a slower read, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Some books call to be read fast, others call to be read slow. This slowly. This one made me slow down, and I really did enjoy it, and I recommend it. But I think a lot of the criticism of the book was the head hopping that happened. So let me know what you think about head hopping. I rarely see positive comments about head hopping, and I can't think of a novel I've read in the last at least 3 or 4 years that don't have a pretty consistent point of view. Or even if they have different points of view, the change in the point of view is signaled by a break in the chapter, or the end of one chapter and the start of a new chapter, and so forth. So you can do shifting points of view, but within the same paragraph, I don't think readers like that. Okay, number 3. This one was a little bit of a surprise to me as I was... it's occurred to me over the last few years. Too many characters too soon. And by that I mean introducing too many characters in the early chapters of a book, such that readers have a hard time keeping track of them or who's who. And I first noticed this because I am fond of recommending as a suspense classic, what I think of as one of the great suspense novels of all time, Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, or 10 Little Indians. The first time I read that book, I was speechless at the end of it because it was so brilliant and so perfectly constructed. And so I always recommend it. And I've noticed that whenever I recommend it and then I ask people what they thought of it, a lot of people say to me, I had a really hard time getting into it because the first part of the book introduces this large cast of characters that I couldn't wrap my head around, and I just couldn't hold on to it, which I find actually kind of odd in that so many people follow TV series and know, like Game of Thrones, for example, and know the backstory and the history of a cast of dozens of characters. I mean, they really can get into all of these characters when they choose to. Maybe the long-term investment in a TV series is much greater because you're going to stick with it over several dozen episodes or years, or in the case of one of my favorite TV shows, The Simpsons, decades. But with a book, they think, this is a one-shot deal. I'm not ever really going to see these characters again unless it's the first book in a series. And publishers are very good about saying on the cover something like introducing X, with X being the name of the protagonist, which indicates that there will be more books with this character in the future. But even so, I think you've got to parcel out the introduction of characters pretty slowly. You've got to pace that in the first several chapters of the book, because if you're throwing too many characters, particularly if they're not well differentiated, at the reader, it becomes kind of like an overwhelming experience. I guess I would compare it to going to a party where you don't know anybody, and within the space of 10 minutes you're introduced to 20 people, and you really can't remember anybody's name except the ones you're attracted to. But for the most part they go shh, because there's just too much coming at you. It's like sensory overload. So I think a cast of characters early in the book on the first page can be very, very helpful. I think, but that having that there does not mean that it's good to throw a lot of characters at the reader early on. I'd say start out slow and then pace the introduction so that readers can at least get a feel for each individual character before they have to meet somebody new at that party, with the party being the book that they're reading. I don't know that I've ever heard a book compared to a party before, but I like it. That's a good comparison, because a good book is as much fun as a good party, but probably lasts longer and maybe more memorable. Okay, so enough of that tortured metaphor. Number 4, something that a lot of readers don't like is profanity. Yes, those 4-letter words. So, my own personal approach to profanity is, I'm a somewhat profane person. I like to curse. I can curse with the best of them, particularly when I'm on the road. And I say words that I didn't even know were in my vocabulary. And I grew up in a house where profanity was not that big a deal. Certain words were frowned on. For the most part, I think my parents thought, we've got bigger fish to fry. If the kids let fly with a piece of profanity every so often, that's, there are other things worth making a big deal about. A lot of people don't like profanity, and even though I like to use it occasionally, I think about listening to stand-up comedians, for example, and a lot of them out there are very, very funny, and a lot of them are very profane. And I always think that if you're truly funny, you can be really funny while keeping the profanity to a minimum. And so I think my favorite comedians tend to do that. They'll slip in a good piece of profanity when it is relevant or will make an impact. But too much of it, it just loses its effectiveness, or its power to shock or whatever. And I think, writers have to be concerned with their words, the words that they use. There aren't that many pieces of profanity in common parlance. I mean, George Carlin had, the 7 words that you can't say on TV? That number has probably expanded somewhat. But I think that by including a lot of profanity in a book, you do sort of decrease your market size. It turns certain people off very, very badly. And the question becomes, are the benefits of using profanity outweighed by let me start over there. do the benefits outweigh the drawbacks of using profanity? And I think that's a question every writer has to answer for himself or herself. A lot of writers say, my characters are part of the underworld, or for verisimilitude, they have to speak this way because that is the way they would speak in the real world. And I think that's a very, very valid point. Others say there are ways to communicate without profanity that will not turn readers off while still getting your point across. I think it's a decision that writers have to make for themselves. But I do know that some readers will close a book if they read high amounts of profanity, particularly very vulgar profanity. Maybe that's a redundant term, vulgar profanity, but you know what I mean. So I'm not really sure what I'm recommending here, except to look closely at your use of profanity and ask yourself if it will decrease your readership, because it may. It may. I don't think I've ever read a review that said, I read this book because I loved its profanity so much. I just couldn't put it down. The profanity is what propelled me along, and I just kept waiting for that profane dialogue to make me a satisfied reader. So think about it, okay? Because a lot of readers don't like it. Related to profanity is sex. So, we have a very odd relationship to sex in the United States. I mean, on the one hand, it's everywhere, in everything. I mean, it's sort of amazing how it's the subtext of almost everything you see on TV and in the media. It's everywhere. At the same time, and books like the 50 Shades series are massive bestsellers, very extremely sexual, all about sex. And then, on the other hand, we can get kind of uptight and puritanical about sex scenes in books. So, a lot of writers handle sex by a technique, I call it closing the bedroom door, where the two lovers enter the bedroom or some other kinky place, and you know what is going to happen, but the door's closed, the chapter ends, you know what's happened. You haven't had a blow-by-blow description of everything that's happened there. Pun intended. Some readers don't want to see that. I think it can be argued that the idea of sex or the suggestion of sex can be more powerful than a sex scene per se. I think I think there's a lot of validity to that idea. I also think it can be very, very effective to show how characters are very sexually attracted to each other. And that is enough to really stimulate the reader's imagination to think about what might be happening behind the bedroom door. But it doesn't have to be explicit. You don't really have to get into anatomical detail. I personally don't know that I could write a sex scene that wouldn't make people laugh. It's just not something I've ever really tried. I don't think it would come naturally to me. But a lot of people do write sex scenes, and I see in reviews people saying, well, I skipped over the obligatory sex scene. Or, if you're going to read this, skip chapter 27 because that's the sex scene and it has no bearing on the plot or whatever. Maybe sex is more important in romance novels, which I don't read a lot of, or any really. But I think putting explicit sex in a book may limit your market. And there are enough readers out there who don't need to see that or feel that it detracts from the book. So the question becomes, does it need to be there? And does it advance anything? Because if you know that the two characters are sleeping together, why do you have to be explicit about what they did, except for purposes of titillation, maybe? But I think if readers want to be titillated, they'll choose erotica and not necessarily something, a mass market paperback. I mean, to tell me what you think about this. I guess I'm of an age where when I read a sex scene, I'm kind of like, yeah, right. I mean, yeah, sex. Okay. So don't make any assumptions about me because I've said that. But a really good novel that I love or would recommend here in my recommendations, it's never because of the sex scenes. It's because of something much more interesting or provocative or memorable. I mean, how many sex scenes are really that memorable? Last Tango in Paris. I can't think of any other one besides that. But maybe you can. And if so, let's talk about it through the comments. Okay, number 6 is a phrase that you hear a lot with regard to mysteries. And it's kind of funny, but not uncommon. And it's a term applied to the protagonist. You may have seen TSTL. TSTL means too stupid to live. So, I mean, it's a good phrase, even if it's a bit insulting to the protagonist. So, too stupid to live means a character engaging in behavior or acts that no sane, rational person would do in reality. So, for example, if a 95-pound petite heroine decides to enter a crack den populated by drug addicts and killers in the worst part of town at on a pitch black night with no moon, that's something that no sane person would do in real life because it's suicide. But there are books where the protagonist will do something like that. Or the hero, is faced with 25 guys all pointing a gun at him, and does something really stupid that would certainly cause him to get shot and die. That would never happen in reality, because if you're standing in a room and 25 guys are pointing guns at you, you're pretty intimidated unless you're a superhero. They've got you over a barrel. So a lot of readers and reviewers, when they see a protagonist do something TSTL, it is a major disconnect for them. It turns them off because they lose respect for the protagonist. And then it's hard to continue reading at the level of engagement you want to read at because you don't respect the protagonist so much anymore. You think that he or she is kind of stupid and really too stupid to live in reality. So what I would recommend for all writers is to step back and say, is this the way a person could reasonably be expected to behave in real life or not? I mean, in the case of the tiny petite heroine entering the crack den at midnight, where 25 guys are there ready to blow her head off or do something really, really nasty to her. If she has a really strong motivation, like let's say her child has been kidnapped and is being held in that crack den, okay, then you can understand her doing something that would be perceived as foolhardy. Or if, if she's been accused of a terrible crime and the only way she can get herself off the hook is by finding someone in that crack den, then she's got the motivation to go in there, even if it's dangerous. That leads to good suspense, in sort of a white knuckle read. But if she's just going into the crack den because she feels kind of curious, or idle curiosity makes her think, oh, maybe I'll find something interesting in there. Why don't I, go in unarmed, unexpected, and not expect that I'll live through the night, because she probably would. So be careful to make sure that your characters are not too stupid to live. That is a real deal breaker for a lot of readers. Speaking of deal breakers, torture and child abuse. Wow. People really hate these things in books. And I understand it. They're awful. A couple of years ago, I was on a panel at a convention. Someone asked me, what do you not like to read? What do you not like to see in a book? And I said, I really don't like to see prolonged descriptions of torture. I have nightmares. I'm very suggestible. I'm very sensitive in that way. It really bothers me. And the same thing with child abuse. A lot of reviewers say when they see torture porn, where they see a child being abused, they can't take it. They literally can't take it. They can't move forward with that book because it's so upsetting to them. So that doesn't stop a lot of writers from being very, very explicit with their violence. I read a book a few years ago by a writer that I really like, and it was so explicit with regard to torture. I haven't been able to read any of her books since, because I thought, life's too short. I don't want to read this kind of violence. But when I mentioned at this panel that I was really turned off by torture, the audience started clapping. Everybody in that room felt the same way. And there were probably 60, 70 people in that room. I mean, I took that to mean that the average reader really doesn't like that. And so I don't have the stomach to write really intense torture or violence when I'm on the writing side of my equation as opposed to the editing side of my equation. But I would suggest really thinking about this. I mean, these things happen in reality, and it's a very sad fact of society that children are abused pretty regularly. If you're going to write a book about that, I think there are ways to make it known what is happening, but without graphic descriptions. But even then, you're really running the risk of losing readers. That's hard to take. One of my favorite writers, Andrew Vox, is an advocate for children. I have great admiration for him. And a lot of his books are about finding people who are abusers of children and bringing them to justice. And those books are strong medicine. They are tough to read. What makes them valuable, I think, is that they do keep awareness of those issues in a public forum, as a topic of public discussion, because it's ongoing. With Vox, you know that he is there in his career fighting for children and children's rights and fighting to get creeps off the streets who take advantage of children. But Vox books are not for the weak-hearted for this very reason. So think about torture porn and whether it's right for your book, and proceed accordingly, because a lot of readers really cannot handle that. Okay, number 8, last of the evening, an unhappy or unresolved ending. So, as Oscar Wilde said, the good end happily, the bad end unhappily. That's what fiction is all about. I think readers of fiction nowadays pretty much demand a happy and resolved ending. They do not like an unresolved ending. It leaves them feeling so dissatisfied. And an unhappy ending, I think, makes them mad because they've thought, this thing that I read for entertainment to maybe take me away from the stresses of my daily life has not done its job of at least making me feel good by the end of that book. At the end of that book, I felt bad, and that's not what I wanted. I don't know if books with unhappy endings can get published these days. I recently read a book. It's this one right here, The Fan by Bob Randall. And I picked this up at a used bookstore, and it was published in 1977, okay, a long time ago, so 40 years ago. Wow. And it's interesting in that it's an epistolary novel, which, who writes letters anymore? I mean, certainly this book couldn't get published today, I think. But its ending is not one that I think any editor or literary agent would touch nowadays. It is not an ending that readers would be satisfied with, or that would make them feel happy. So I don't think this will come as a surprise to many of you. I know in my own writing I've tried unresolved endings, and my editors have said, no way, get rid of it, change it. And I did, and it was the right thing to do for the book, but that's sort of my own, I like an unresolved ending, but I don't think I am at all representative of the reading market there. Last thing, I didn't make a high-tech visual aid for this one, is I think people also don't like unnamed narrators. I've read a few books that are told in the first person, where you never learn the name of the person telling the story. And I think readers find that a little pretentious and annoying, and I say that because I see this written in reviews. I think the one exception to that I can name is a favorite of mine. I eat his books up, and Bill Pronzini, who's a grandmaster, and his series character was known for many years as the Nameless Detective. In later books, we find out that his name is Bill, much like the author. Bill Pronzini is a master for a reason. His stories are so well crafted and so tight with good twists, and he really knows what he's doing. And Nameless never bothered me back in the day. There was just something about the way Bill Bronzini told his stories that didn't bother me that I didn't know the nameless detective's name. But in other books, I don't think it works as well. So maybe if you're thinking about having a nameless protagonist, go back to some of the earlier books in Bill Bronzini's series and see what he does and then try to emulate it. Because I think it can be off-putting if you're not really careful. Okay, so we've talked about things that readers don't like, or at least that I perceive readers don't like. So let's end with something or someone whom this reader really likes. And so that's my recommendation of the evening for a writer who I think is terrific. Her writing is, it's a little hard for me to describe. It's a little surreal in that I consider it almost hyper-realism in that it really puts a magnifying glass over a certain segment of society or the population of a town or a subculture and examines it in such detail that it becomes almost, I don't want to say mythical, but it takes on a feeling of such intensity that when you close the book, you really feel like you have been immersed in the world of a microscope because everything has been so finely observed. And her name, the author's name, is Megan Abbott. And Megan Abbott was first introduced to me by my very good friend, Cheryl Salamini. And Cheryl has very, very, her standards are very high. So she would never recommend a writer that she didn't really, really like. And so when she recommended Megan Abbott to me, I thought, I've got to check her out. I'm really glad I did. So the book I just showed you, Dare Me, I talked about there being kind of a microscope with Dare Me, the microscopic world being analyzed as that of cheerleaders. And then in this book, The Fever, which was superb. It's a story of mass hysteria in a town that is fueled by the internet and social media. I don't want to give away too many details of the book, but teenagers in a certain town start to become ill. And word gets out that the illness may have been caused by a vaccine. And we all know about the huge controversies over vaccines. And once this word gets out, it mushrooms to the point of panic. And as you're reading, the interactions in this book are just so intense. Like I said, there's this microscope or this magnifying glass where you're watching events play out in this town. And you can't put the book down because the prose, I mean, The Fever is a great title because the prose is, while very controlled, it's also very feverish to convey this sense of contagion that's sweeping through the town and the real hysteria that is happening because of the rumors that are being fed by texting and Facebook and, you know, all the other methods of electronic communication that we have today. So I think Megan Abbott is just a terrific writer with really good ideas. Her ideas for her books are so focused and so, I keep using the word intense, but they immerse you and they grab you in, and and they don't let you go until the final page. So I really look forward to each of her new books. I think so. If this sounds appealing to you, pick up a Megan Abbott book. I think you'll really enjoy it. I always like to, not like, but I mention the readers that I think would not find these books appealing. And I think if you're looking for more of a traditional mystery or whodunit, if you're looking for a lighthearted read, I don't think these books would be right for you. Her books aren't a fast read. They demand that you pay attention to every word and every paragraph. And I really admire a writer who can make me do that. You know, sometimes when I'm tired and I want to read quickly, I don't necessarily appreciate being forced to slow down unless the book makes it worth slowing down for. And Megan Abbott's books are definitely worth slowing down for. You read them very closely because there's always the sense of so much bubbling beneath the surface, so much angst and anxiety and the unspoken that you don't want to miss anything because you're afraid if you read too quickly you may miss something. And when you close the book, you always feel that you've had a reading experience. Not that you've finished a book, but that you have had a reading experience. And I think readers will know exactly what I mean by that. There's a difference between just finishing a book and feeling that you have, that the book has had an effect on you or changed you somehow or altered your perceptions permanently. And Megan Abbott's books have done that for me. So check her out. I think she's got a new one coming out pretty soon. I should have looked it up before I made this video. But I will definitely read it when it comes out. And as always, I thank you for listening. And hope you've got lots of good books stored up for the winter. If you haven't, go buy some new books so that the publishers can get revenue and the authors can get royalties. I unabashedly make the case for that. I'm not saying otherwise, other than buying new books is a very good thing and a tremendous value for the price. And they make great holiday gifts, so buy them for everyone on your holiday list as well. Okay, good night. Thank you.